technically, Native people in Karluk just were allowed to live there. People don't realize is that we grew up in a bear refuge. We couldn't own any land. And the people in Larsen Bay and Karluk had no voice in when that refuge was formed. They never asked the natives whether they wanted it or not. The bears, all the time I grew up, had more rights than we did. And Answer was a way for us to finally own the land we lived on.
It's one of the most breathtaking places on Earth. There isn't a bad view on Kodiak Island. It's rolling green hills, it's rocky cliff sides, it's 1,000 bays that all sound different.
I love everything about it. We used to go out, my mom and I, with our scarves on our heads, buckets, and we would go out by the ponds, down by the beaches and pick grass for weaving, and also wild vegetables that we would use.
Growing up on a subsistence lifestyle, you lived by the season. Because if you miss the season, you miss the food. I don't realize how much fish I eat, but I do eat a lot of fish all the time. A normal family in the lower 48 would probably eat 1/10 the fish we eat. But we don't notice it because it's just the way we are, you know.
Who am I? I am a Lutic. It's a matter of pride, and it's the way I was raised. Our ancestors went through a lot just to exist.
The Kodiak people are coastal people. They've lived on Kodiak for over 7,000 years. It's one people that have lived on that island continuously.
The Lutic people never had land ownership in their history. They lived to use the land. As an example, if you had a house and I wanted to build a house next to you, I just went and asked you, could I build next to you and be your neighbor? Sure. There was no, oh, I own this, I own that, you own this. Nobody owned it. You just used it, and you kind of left it as good as you could.
There's an old saying that I heard from elders years ago, and I love it so much, and it's that if you take our land, you take our blood. It's all of us. It's everything that we do, everything we're made of. This is all about the resources, natural resources that were going to be taken, the oil companies and the pipeline and all of that. And so everybody got onto it because you can't, don't take any of this out of here. This is our land. But what do you do if you don't have title to it?
The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed in 1971, and what it did was it established a right to ownership in the eyes of Congress for Alaska Native people to their own lands. And so while we obviously couldn't keep all of our lands, it settled land claims in Alaska, and that's made corporations stewards of land.
Well, when they passed the Settlement Act, they gave out rules that we were supposed to form the corporation, elect an interim board, get your shareholders, elect a permanent board, for 2 or 3 year terms, whatever it was. But there was no money set aside for that. So nobody got paid anything. We scrounged money to pay for fares and per diem, but the way other side of the coin is we had to train all the villages on how to select land, where the land was. That took at least 3 years. And we used our money that was supposed to go to investments to do that because that's the only money we had. So for the first few years, Koniag was always broke.
You're talking about people who have lived a subsistence lifestyle, living off of the land, and suddenly, not a ton of people were college educated and set up to be the owners of corporate stock or set up to run those corporations.
We had a a number of prominent individuals connected with the Anska. Carl Armstrong, certainly.
He was a brilliant person when it came to dealing with the government. And he was really a person who made Koniag what it is today, because without him, we would have never had our shareholders. And many of the other regions wouldn't either. And he was the one that got the rules changed so we could enroll people who weren't full-blooded. And me included. So I'm only a quarter. He knew that if we didn't allow people that weren't full-blooded, we would be all crippled. And that's what the government tried to do. Their attitude in Washington was, oh, we'll get it all back eventually anyway. That's exactly what their attitude was. But they're not going to.
Well, our big issue at the formation of Koniag was to get all the land, which was successful, but that was mainly through Carl Armstrong's efforts by lobbying in Congress.
This is Pete and Nina Olson, my mother and father, and my dad was on the Koniag board. When
you sat on the board, you affected over 3,000 people. And that concept was kind of hard on a lot of people. Some of them didn't want to take the responsibility, and some did. And then used to have big battles. Our board meetings lasted till midnight and 1 o'clock, trying to iron out all these little differences to make sure we did it right. You know, all the members of the board back then were village presidents or council members, and their whole goal was to help their people. Most of them didn't get paid in the early days. They did it because that was what you're supposed to do.
I can't give them enough praise for what they did. It couldn't have been easy, that's for sure. From where they started to where we are today, it's been a long road, and they were the ones that kept it together in the beginning. The 80s were still getting your act together, so to speak, feeling out different things and finding where your comfort zone was. And 90s is where we started getting, I think, serious about building the business and becoming a real player. I think Anska was probably as good as we could have come up with, as it turns out. I wasn't so sure in the beginning. At least it gave us some control over our lands and our resources, whereas before that it was going entirely in a bad direction.
You know, natives don't operate the way everybody else does. They have their own way of doing things. And basically, it goes down to family and the land and the way we live.
No matter what circumstances it's in, I always come home and feel like I'm home. Some people don't feel that. They're not connected to a place like that. But it's always this sense that my family has lived in this place for thousands of years. And why wouldn't I be there?
I think now we're there. It's just now continuing the growth and continuing to building on what we learned in those early years. I believe Koniag's work in educating our people and providing opportunities for our people is the biggest advantage to being a Koniag shareholder and part of the Alutiiq family.
The Koniag value that speaks to me the most is sharing the catch. That's such an important theme when you look at our family relationships and our kinship bonds and our neighbors and our friends and our small communities. It's that taking care of each other.
I believe you have to know who you are to know where you're going.
I hope that Koniag, 10 years in the future, is still innovating and finding new ways to provide value for our shareholders, while at the same time finding innovative ways to be stewards of the place that we live in.
The big focus of Anska is on the lands, but the land is the people and the culture. It's all tightly connected. I mean, if it wasn't for the people and the culture, the land wouldn't be anything.